Science, and I've been asked to represent the Research Ethics Committee of the Social, Behavioural and Educational Committee. So it's the other Human Ethics Committee. And I've been asked to talk about what it is that we do, but specifically I thought I wanted to frame what we do a little bit more clearly, because I think there's little understanding of what it is that we exactly do and why we do it. Why do we ask you all these silly questions that you have to fill out? Clarissa, could you just confirm that my screen is showing?
Yes, it is showing. Maybe if you can just go to the next slide, because sometimes
that's it. Yeah, no, that's perfectly fine. I just wanted to know that it's showing because it's not showing on my screen here. Yeah, so let's hope there's no technical issues. But anyways, so I'm just going to start off by saying, giving you some background on why it is that we have this ethics application process, why you have to do it when you work with humans. So in the 1990s, a number of social scientists specifically identified what they call the new culture on the make in academia, in which pervasive practices of accountability tied to specific political regimes started to mark the management of teaching and research. So one specific person, Marion Strathern, an anthropologist like myself, referred to this as an audit culture, a culture that also pervaded other spheres of social and political life. And she says, apart from its other effects of this audit culture, one of the results of this audit culture was that academics saw an increasing formalization of the moral charters that had guided their research ethics in many of their disciplines up to this point. So up to the 1990s, it was pretty common to leave academics to do their own thing, to be guided by moral charters rather than these very clear rules and processes that we are very familiar with today. All right, and as this audit culture became a routine part of daily life, academics were increasingly subjected to the dreaded ethics application process that we are so familiar with today. Today, the Stellenbosch University's auditing of research ethics is in turn audited by a national body in government, the National Health Research Ethics Council, that has statutory and disciplinary oversight over the work that we do, just to give you a kind of sense of where we're at, right? So it's not just because we're interested in your work, which we are, but we're also governed by this larger body. So and this means that the institution has to,
Are you changing your slides because it's still on the cover
No,
slide?
it has to stay there. Yeah, don't worry.
Perfect.
I'm still contextualizing. Thanks, Clarissa. And this means that the institution has to comply with this national NHREC's prescriptions, and that individuals can be prosecuted for ethical breaches in their work. So this is a long shift away from, being let on your own to do what you feel is right and guided by your discipline. This is a long way from that. And while we might, and I particularly did, balk at this intrusion in our research, and the bureaucratization, I think, is what we all complain about most, of what has often been imagined as moral questions in research. The last 100 years of academic research has also shown that advances in science develop faster than moral codes. And unfortunately, not all scientists have developed the same fine-tuned moral compasses that guide most of your own work. So in this short presentation, I want to look at a few of these cases, the ethical quandaries that they brought up and the codes that they subsequently inspired in academic auditing cultures, the stuff that now guide our work. And for this, I'm going to start with a particularly dark period in history, where the limits of the physician's Hippocratic Oath, a moral code to which practitioners in medicine widely subscribe, came to the fore in the most spectacular way. So I'm going to just take you back to the 1930s and 1949s. Okay, so what we have in the 1930s and 1949 specifically was an era in which Japanese and Nazi medical sciences at first did horrific experiments on humans. And these experiments, as you know, served the interests of the state. And what was very specific and very worrying for other scientists was that these scientists could exclude certain humans from the moral code that covered the Hippocratic Oath, right? So we suddenly saw a number of people who were not included in the Hippocratic Oath anymore, all right? So In the aftermath of, or in the wider academic context, we also saw other scientists enthusiastically offer their expertise to the war effort, as the Manhattan Project in the USA did, and to the furthering of national ideals, such as racial hygiene, as the ones in Nazi Germany did. So we saw, for instance, social scientists getting really involved in these national projects, in which they could decide who counted as human and who wasn't. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, there was a period of international reckoning with the scientific legacies of these projects in courts, such as the Nuremberg trials, and in the USA, or specifically in the trial of the USA versus Brunt, which was part of the Nuremberg trials. It was also known as the doctor's trial. We saw German physicians who were responsible for conducting unethical medical procedures on humans during the war, arguing that there was actually no law that differentiated between legal and illegal experiments. So they said they were off the hook, and this eventually led to what became known as the Nuremberg Code. And this specifically enshrined the scientific values of voluntary consent, the social value of research, so you can't just do research because you're interested in something, and then the protection of human subjects against even remote possibilities of injury, disability, or death. The professionalism of trained scientists is a fourth issue. So you needed to know the science that you were doing research in order to conduct research. You have to show that your project was valid. And then lastly, the right of human participants to pull out of any study at almost any time, right? So all of those 5 rules suddenly became codes that people could be held to. So they weren't as loose and as individualistic as the Hippocratic Oath were up to that point. So the code's main values about the universal human suffrage, not just what you could determine who's human and who's not human, was further underwritten in 1948 when the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, but unfortunately, within 10 years, creative new studies and advances in science meant that the code did not cover the new ethical quandaries that arose from research, both social and medical.
Ilana,
so which brings us, yeah.
Can't see your slides anymore.
Oh, does it disappear? I had such beautiful slides. Hold on, let me try again.
You were at the dictator. Yeah. Let me just see.
There we go. Let's hope that does it.
That does it.
There we go. We're back to the 1950s. There we go.
Wonderful. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. So in the 1950s and 60s, this is within 10 years of this wonderful code being written, we see the publication in social sciences of an interesting book by Vidic and Bensman called Small Town and Mass Society. And at first, a lot of people were very interested in it, but the original publication of the book caused a sharp response from the town's citizens who complained and felt that their trust had been violated by these 2 researchers, because the 2 men relied heavily on overheard conversations, so they eavesdropped in cafes and so on, and covert observations. So they thought they would study these people in a natural environment, and therefore felt, they felt that this is a naturalistic way of studying a society. But the townspeople felt that they were violated, their privacy was violated. And they also felt that the town was misrepresented in the study as a small town, and they imagined themselves to be a medium-sized town, and they said, that they should be represented as a more cosmopolitan place. They said both of these things, this violation of their privacy and the misrepresentation, actually caused harm. And as you can see, this harm is not covered by the old Nuremberg Code. So there was no way in which these scientists could be held to account for a breach of ethical codes, because none of them were codified at that stage. All right. So that was the first sort of small blip in this sense that the Nuremberg Code wasn't covering everything that it needed to cover.
Me again, Ilana. Could you make your slides bigger, please?
Gosh.
I'll stop bothering you now.
No, not at all. No, for some reason there seems to be. How's that, Clarissa?
We can see it in full view.
Oh my word. Okay, but now I can't see my presentation.
Well, the slides were big enough. If it's not bothering anyone else, then maybe you can keep it in PowerPoint mode.
Yeah, I'll just send you the whole, when they are nice and big. Apologies,
Perfect.
colleagues. There seems to be a little technical glitch on my side. All right. The other big thing that happened in the 1950s, 60s was, I'm probably sure you know about them, thalidomide trials. And what was important here or interesting about these trials was the unforeseen consequences of a drug that helped with nausea and pregnancy. So who should be held responsible for its continued distribution? And remember, this drug, even though it caused severe birth defects, continued to be distributed for 5 whole years. And the question then was, who should be held responsible ethically for the consequences, the severe birth defects that was caused by this drug? All right. Which brings us to the 1960s, and for the environmentalist amongst you, you'll probably recall Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was published. And the question is, why is this ethical? What this book brought was the ethical issue around the widespread use of DDT. And she showed what enormous effect agricultural production and pest control had on human health. So this book then expanded ethics beyond the context of research testing, in the lab, how good this thing is in killing stuff, to ask how we are responsible to a larger natural world and its long afterlife of the stuff that we develop. So, who should be held responsible, and what are your ethical responsibilities in a study like this? And started especially in agricultural research to ask those as ethical questions rather than questions just about validity. All right. Between 1961 and 1965, we also saw the infamous, if you want, Stanley Milgram's experiments. Now, in these experiments, Stanley carried out a series of experiments at Yale University in which human subjects were instructed to administer what they thought were progressively more painful electric shocks to other humans, to determine to what extent people would obey orders even when they knew them to be painful and immoral. So this was a study on how obedient people were. And these people were all graduate students in psychology. Now,
Lana?
Yeah.
Sorry, we can't see the slides anymore. So if you can just...
my word, this thing is causing me no end of trouble. Apologies,
I
colleagues.
would say maybe not put your slide into, just display the PowerPoint app, because then you can see it and then we can see it as well.
Yeah, no, it's just it has
Perfect.
that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It keeps on going on and off. Apologies, colleagues. There we go. All right. And what Stanley Milgram's experiment brought up, while it physically didn't harm any of the actors receiving the shocks, the obedient participants who the participants who were obedient, the guys who gave the shocks or thought they gave the shocks, experienced acute psychological distress after the experiment because they were brought up or they were confronted with the potential of causing harm. So they thought only monsters would do such a thing. And yet they found themselves highly educated students of psychology being put in a situation where they quite willingly were giving shocks that could have killed, if they were actually connected, could have killed people. So again, the study brought up the limits of the ethical guidelines and codes that were in place up to this point, because they didn't cover psychological distress as something that academics had to worry about. In 1964, we saw a kind of an updating of universal moral code, ethical code, if we want, in the form of the Helsinki Declaration on Medical Research with Human Subjects. And this update added that scientists were also responsible to protect life, health, dignity, very importantly, the integrity of participants, and the right to self-determination of people who participate in human research. And then interestingly added privacy and confidentiality for the first time. So quite a large expansion of what scientists became responsible for. But despite the revision, this revision and other codes like it, and we saw, in the 1960s, we see this proliferation of ethical guidelines and codes in all kinds of disciplines in academia. This didn't stop unethical clinical research, and it kind of continued almost unabated. And we saw this in 1966. There's just one case where Henry Beecher alerted scientists and doctors in the New England Journal of Medicine to 22 unethical studies that he just came across. And these included the Tuskegee syphilis study, and I hope you've heard of this awful study. The Tuskegee study, for those of you who don't know, started in 1932 under the auspices of the United States Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on a group of nearly 600 African-American men with syphilis to observe the natural progression of the disease. The men of the study were not told what it was about, and they were only told that this was a study on bad blood. And the men were not offered any treatment. Even after, in 1943, penicillin was found to be very effective treatment for syphilis. So these men were not offered this treatment, and the scientists involved basically wanted to see what the natural progression of this study was. The trial only ended in 1972, and only because it caused an uproar when it was exposed in a newspaper, and it eventually led to a class action lawsuit. So despite these codes, United States Public Health Service actually did very, very unethical research. In the social sciences, the late 1950s, 60s, and 70s saw a growing number of academics questioning the ethics of government-sponsored classified research, and in places like Vietnam during the Vietnam War, in Thailand, in Latin America, we saw the Project Camelot, for instance, 1964 onwards, where social scientists were paid by the government to basically spy on people who were situated in war zones where America had an interest or other parties had an interest. In particular, these social scientists raised questions about the harms that such intelligence often resulted into for participant communities. So not directly done by the researchers, but what harm the intelligence that they gathered led to for people who participate in this research. Whether it was possible to secure consent in a situation where such differentials in power existed. So, you know, if a very well-funded American scholar came to your area in Thailand while you were being bombed by Americans, whether you could actually say no, whether informed consent was even possible. And whether social scientists should ethically liable for the deaths caused. So some of this intelligence actually pinpointed which communities posed a threat to the state. So, you know, these very difficult questions started coming up. And none of our codes or guidelines actually gave clear rules or guidelines on how to deal with them. So let's move on to the next, golly. The 1970s, where we have continued concerns about researchers spying and working with the state. What does it mean for the people that participate in our work? We also, in 1978, had the first in vitro conception, a woman who was named Louise Brown, which brought up issues, ethical issues about human tissue, reproduction, that weren't covered by any of the codes that existed up to this point. So here we had a case of science developing much faster than our codes, and you know, very little was in place. What do you do with the eggs, for instance, that were fertilized, but that weren't implanted? Can you throw them away? And there were no clear answers. In 1979, we saw another update on ethical codes, the Belmont Report, which very specifically codified informed consent across the world. So it codified the rules around what consent meant. What does informed consent meant? Firstly, it had to include respect for people, beneficence, actually don't do harm, and justice. And what they meant by justice was to ensure that reasonable, non-exploitative and well-considered procedures were administered fairly, i.e. that the cost and benefits to potential research participants were distributed equally. So all three of those things, respect, beneficence and justice, became codified in this report and accepted by large numbers of academics, universities and governments, and in some cases led to laws being rewritten around it. Which brings me to the 1980s. So in the 1980s, we see a very interesting trend in ethics. And one of the bad cases, if you want to call it this, very famous cases, was in 1981. It actually started this whole trend, was when a young scholar, John Darcy, he was a very fast-rising medical researcher, was found guilty of fabricating data. So initially, from nothing, he just fabricated data. He never actually did the research that he claimed he had done. So he fabricated data and published in all these high-flying journals. And initially, 17 of his papers were retracted, and later more than 80 of his papers. So almost all of his output was retracted. But interesting about this case was not that the researcher Darcy was held individually responsible, but that the investigation saw his supervisor and his wider research team criticized for their lax supervision and for creating what, in the committee's words, was a hurried pace and emphasis on productivity, coupled with limited interaction with senior scientists, which contributed to the ease with which Darcy was able to fabricate data. So this, for the first time, kind of put the spotlight on oversight in academic settings. So a very interesting and new shift in focus. In 1982, probably inspired by the Darcy case, Broad and Wade published a book called Betrayers of Truth. And in this book, very interestingly, they argued that the conventional wisdom that science is a strictly logical process, with objectivity the essence of a scientist's attitudes, with errors speedily corrected by rigorous peer scrutiny and experiment replication, was actually mythical. It's a mythical ideal that they said in reality wasn't often a true reflection of what happened. Scientists, they said, are also influenced by such non-rational factors as rhetoric, propaganda, personal prejudice, and ambition, and that these other factors also influence the conduct of scientific research, from the manipulation of results to the total fabrication of whole experiments. And this kind of insight saw the era of what became known as fraud busting in science. So more and more scientists started looking at their colleagues' data, trying to figure out who had cheated. And very shockingly, Martin Luther King was caught up. By this stage, he was already no longer with us. But it was found that his PhD dissertation was largely plagiarized. And this caused, as you can imagine, quite a discomfort. In how to deal with his legacy, how to deal with his work, and what do we make of this kind of dishonesty in science? All right. Brings me to the 1990s, and this is the age of when the Human Genome Project was launched, where the EU complained about genetically modified crops, started banning those, and as you can see by the slide, in 1996, when Dolly was cloned. And this era of enormous advances in science, again, saw science leaping ahead of the kind of codes and guidelines that would have guided academics, scientists in how to deal with the stuff that this brought up. The stuff around human genetic data. Do people have a right to the products of the research that stem from their genetic data? For instance, very famously, the HeLa project for the scientists that belongs to you. So, who owns that stuff that is so intricately bound to your selfhood? What do we do with cloned animals? Can we eat them, and so on and so forth? So a lot of kind of scrutiny started being placed on this stuff. 1990s was the age when scientists, after this age of fraud busting, started asking questions about biomedicine's relationship with research funding and the outcomes of research studies. So you probably know of studies that showed that suddenly, because of this connection between scientists and money, a lot of research started the research started being skewed towards positive outcomes, and researchers not reporting negative outcomes of studies that weren't successful, and so on and so forth, right? So what do these financial interests, how do they skew outcomes, and what are the ethics of that? How do we keep science scientific if we have vested interests? All right. Which brings me to the 2000s, and what we see in the 2000s is again a shift where universities, governments started formalizing ethics training. Suddenly, ethics training was required in many countries as a core component of a PhD program, for instance. Universities had to show to governments like ours that you've done ethics training, and reporting was also more and more formalized and bureaucratized. So from the early 2000s onwards, as Marilyn Strathern noted, we see this extreme formalization of rules and reporting on ethics specifically. And unfortunately, we've all been pulled into this stream, right? We also see journals attempting to try and define contributions to papers. So as you probably know, in the sciences, you often have long strings of people as authors, and journals started asking who did what, because the concerns around what happens in a lab, that a supervisor, for instance, would just add his or her name to a paper because they were in a position of power. So, this attempt to address the power inequalities within labs, within universities, started. We also saw the start of concerns around data security, and not just in terms of the privacy, as we saw earlier, and the privacy around individual information that we had from the 1930s onwards, but about what people outside of academia can do with data. So in 2009, for those of you who need a little bit of a refresher, the University of East Anglia's climatic research unit was hacked, and specifically hacked by people, by climate change skeptics who wanted access to the raw data because they were convinced that this data, the climatic research unit's data, was manipulated to tell only one story. So it kind of brought to light the fact that these researchers, and this is what some of the emails said, refused to share their data with people who disagreed with them. So that also brought up ethical issues around what our responsibilities are. Do we hand over raw data to people who disagree with us and who can then manipulate it to suit their own work? And these questions, obviously, there are not clear answers yet, but we're working towards this. All right. This is just a very, very broad overview of the start and the formation of today's audit culture. The culture in which we are caught, in which we are sort of, that we don't have much of a choice of in participating in. So at Stellenbosch, our REC, as I said, was audited. So we're part of this auditing culture, and the regulations that govern this audit are, in the first instance, the Constitution, and around research. It is very interested specifically in informed consent and the dignity of human participants. So we need to, as regs, make sure that those two things are adequately covered. We're also covered by the National Health Act, number 61 of 2003, which determines very clearly that we need to audit and make sure that all research on humans cover the dignity of those humans, support those, the autonomy of participants, informed consent, that we make sure that vulnerable persons are protected, and that their confidentiality of the information is protected, that no harm come to them, that maximum benefit is gotten out of research, so this includes scientific validity, and that justice is served in research, right? So in 2013, you'll recall, we also saw the promulgation of the POPIA Act, the Data Protection Act, which we also have to audit for. And another thing that influenced our auditing culture at Stellenbosch are precedents like the awful coloured woman study. So what that led to is new ways in which we have approached studies that specifically want to focus on race. So we are influenced by these precedents as well. And finally, just the last slide, I'm done in a minute, is this is what it leads to. So these are the kind of categories that we at the Social Behavioral and Educational REC, which is the Research Ethics Committee, look at when we then audit. I'm going to just call it audit or adjudicate applications. So we need to make sure and tick these boxes in order to pass applications that come our way. So we need to make sure that no harm is done, and that harm includes physical, emotional, and reputational harm to participants. So they cannot be harmed by participating, as they were, for instance, in the coloured woman study. We need to make sure that informed consent was given by everyone who participated in this research, that people's privacy are protected, their confidentiality. So we need to make sure that the data is stored in such a way that the confidential information is not shared with, for instance, data-hungry organizations like commercial enterprises. That no covert research is done. That we have a responsibility to others in the discipline. So you cannot do research that will harm the discipline and therefore make it impossible for someone else to go back. And we have to account for or be mindful of power differences with participants, between us and the participants that take part in our work. So these are the sort of audit lines that we have to tick in all of our work. Colleagues, it's exactly half an hour later, and I am on that note, I'm going to hand over to Mariana, who is the head of the Health Ethics Research Committee. And after her presentation, we're going to open up for a nice long question and answer session. So thank you very much for that. Mariana, it's on to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm just trying to get the right buttons to click. Thank you very much for a very comprehensive journey through research ethics since the 1930s. And I'm just immediately going to try and upload my presentation. I'm sorry it takes a bit of time because, like usual, I'm using an Apple Mac instead of a Dell's computer. Yeah, there's some new things coming up. Just a second. So while I'm waiting for the presentation to load, just to say that I'm currently the chair of Human Research Ethics Committee 2 in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. Well, now it's maybe just restart because it says there's problems.
We could actually see your slides, Professor. So I'm not sure if it's... Yes, we could see it, the cover page.
It's an interesting thing that I couldn't see it. It says on my side, it says it's difficulty uploading.
Oh.
Yeah. So let's see if can you see it now?
Something's happening. Check.
Okay. So
yes, you can see it.
Background. I have to immediately start saying I do have a disclaimer. I am co-director and founder of SARECI, which is South African Research Ethics Training Initiative at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and we are funded by faculty at the NIH. So for the past 20 years, my passion and hobby was research ethics, and I've been training several. This program is capacity building for ethics review in Africa, and we have to date close to 60 master students, and we currently selected 10 PhD students. So know that when I start that research ethics is my passion, and now that I'm retired, I can be the chair again of the Ethics Review Committee. So my talk will be far more focused on the researchers itself, and there will be some historical background again, but it is more to really guide both you and research ethics committees about how to review. What do we do when we review a protocol? So when I start off, I want to say that taking it from the 1990s onward with the history of research ethics, we need to realize that there were a lot of debates with regards to the research of ethics, with research ethics in developing countries, because it was especially the time that the HIV/AIDS pandemic started, and everybody was onto the new medicines and antiretroviral therapies, and we know that we've had a tremendous history of negating HIV/AIDS in those times. But what often happens, and I remember still one of my students from Burkina Faso saying they had no AIDS at the time in the early 2000s, but malaria was killing a majority of persons. But everybody was doing HIV/AIDS research in Burkina Faso instead of focusing on what is really needed for the context. And these debates with regards to research in developing countries led to quite numerous workshops and etc. And so I was very fortunate to be part of a workshop at the NIH where Ezekiel Emanuel and his colleagues started developing the framework of benchmarks of ethical research in developing countries. And I just want to immediately say that when you are busy with research and research ethics, there is no right way to do a wrong thing. So you have to make sure that you can do the right thing at all times. So somebody has now, I don't see my slides anymore.
We've lost your slides.
Yeah, so I'll have to restart it and see what happened. But just to come back to Ezekiel Emanuel, then with his colleagues from the NIH, he himself, like myself, started off as a pediatric Asian oncologist. I'm a pediatric oncologist, but he moved into research ethics, and he really debated the issues of what it will be ethical in developing countries, and they invited quite numerous persons from all over the world to participate in these workshops, where after they published the benchmarks of ethical research in developing countries. Can you see the slide already? Or
not yet, Professor.
Okay.
Oh, something's happening.
Okay, so please bear with me. I think there's all this load shedding. So let me
see the front page.
There we are. There we are. Okay, so and one of the issues that at the time was debated and are still being debated in the context from an African perspective, because that is my main focus, is that there's multiple interpretations of the guidelines, and it's varying from contradictory to controversial. And so everybody started interpreting it as it can be. And so we've had quite a number of really major research disasters doing research in developing countries without really any social value or benefit to the society. So some of the core issues that came up in these discussions were this: what is standard of care? Because often what happened is that researchers from high-income countries would move into a low-income country and say, well, you don't have anything for this particular disease, so therefore we can test anything, and we can compare it to what your standard of care is, which is nothing. Now, the guidelines subsequently have been influenced by this, and so standard of care is at least the least minimum invasive therapy that is available, but if there's nothing in existence, you cannot claim anymore that that is standard of care. So that was the very first big issue from a developing country perspective. The second one was that if you are going to investigate something, then and there's benefit to the participants who participated, you should thereafter make sure that there's reasonable availability of these either medicines or interventions post the research. So if you cannot make sure that that's going to happen, then you shouldn't be conducting this research in developing countries. And then the last major issue came about with informed consent, because we know that there's very varying forms of education in African countries or in low and middle income countries, ranging from illiterate populations to very sophisticated and informed participants. And you should make sure that everybody can understand and can participate in an informed consent process, because regardless of the fact whether they can read or write, they do have personal autonomy, and they should be respected for that personal autonomy. So, and I've decided for this introduction lecture, from my perspective, really to take you through how we developed this framework and how we apply it from an ethics review perspective. But when Ezekiel Emanuel and his colleagues documented it, they actually also did it as a guideline to researchers to guide them on how to do research within the context of a developing country. So going to the next slide, and there I have Zig Emmanuel. He's a very dynamic man, and he really is worthwhile to read if you are interested in Zig Emmanuel in any research ethics issues. He's broadly published on many, many topics, and it really guides a lot all researchers and ethics review committees. So when they did this benchmark of ethical research in developing countries, they targeted both the researchers and the ethics review committees members, as I've already said, and their main aim was to ensure that there's no exploitation of populations that are disadvantaged just because they are in no middle income country and have limited access to whether it's healthcare or education or whatever is the focus of the research. And in their framework, they based it on the general ethical values that we all share, that namely that we should have honesty and we should be honest with each other in dealing with it, that there's scientific integrity when we're doing research, and that we avoid fraud, as already has been mentioned earlier. So, but Zig Emmanuel himself says these benchmarks are complex if you start really thinking and reflecting on them, because research in general is a complex matter. So what are these benchmarks? And here they are. First, and I've put them in the order that I'm going to present them. That's not necessarily his order, but it's scientific validity, social value, fair selection of study population, a favorable risk-benefit ratio, collaborative partnership, independent review, informed consent, and respect for recruited participants and communities. And I'm going to stop on each of them because I think, and I'm going to do it actually from the researcher perspective, who is actually preparing a protocol for ethics review, that you think in terms of that, and then most of you will also understand what the comments are when it comes back from an ethics review committee. So if we come to scientific validity, very often we as ethics review members, committee members get this response from researchers: you don't understand the science, and because you don't understand the science, you criticize it, and you should, and if this is not part of ethics, you should rather stay only within the framework of ethics. Now, the first thing about any research protocol, whether it's social science or whether it is in the scientific field, scientific validity is an ethical requirement. So there should be a very good research design, and that research design should be able to answer the question that is posed, and especially make sure that it links to the aim and what the objectives are. And just coming from our recent ethics review committee meeting, I can say that one of the protocols that we've sent back for modification is that you had a title, but the title did not link to the aim, and the aim did not link to the objectives, and the methodology was completely something different. So one has to have a logical order where your title is a summary actually of what your aim is going to be, with your objectives being very well listed and methodology appropriately placed. So crucial to the first part of ethics review, or from the researcher perspective, is do you have scientific validity for what you are putting on paper? The next question in this protocol to answer then is, will this make sure that there's useful information generated? Will the beneficiaries eventually benefit from it? Maybe it's not always possible that the individual participant is going to benefit, but it should at least be post-benefit benefit for the group of persons that you are doing research on. Then we go to the next one, and that's a community or the society. Is this feasible in that particular community or in that particular society? We know that we're living in multicultural society, especially in South Africa, and we have varying numbers of communities ranging from very high income context to very low income. And we need to ask ourselves, is this feasible in the context? Are we not selecting this particular community because they're easily accessible, and that there's a potential risk of exploitation? So one has to make very sure that what you are doing is truly in the interest of that particular group and will lead to potential benefit in future. And while we're at this, it may require education of the research team to make sure that they do understand all the aspects of the science, and to make sure that we construct additional facilities or at least provide the necessary medicines or interventions for the study. And I can just say that, I mean, in my career now in Sareti, having traveled to several African countries to train researchers and or ethics review committee members in research ethics, You can end up in places like, for example, in Kenya, and then you have this absolutely state-of-the-art, beautiful, fantastic hospital with all the necessary facilities created. And just next door is the ordinary healthcare clinic for the ordinary persons. And it's really always a very great discomfort when you see the state-of-the-art medicine on the one side for the malaria facility, and next to it the ordinary ugly, really horrible building for the ordinary diseases. So these are the kind of things that you need to think of when you are preparing for this for research. The next important benchmark is in social value, and you need to then go and reflect: am I going to do something that will be beneficial to the community where I'm going to recruit my participants? Will they truly benefit? And I'm going to refer back to Burkina Faso, where malaria is probably one of the best, most important killers of patients, and they had 1 to 2% of patients being infected with HIV, but all the clinical trials focused on HIV/AIDS instead of focusing on malaria. So that is really exploitation of that particular population, because this is not their need. So is the generation of the knowledge that I'm going to get out of my research protocol really going to be beneficial to the community that I'm taking my participants from? It's a question I have to answer. We know that early studies, and this is particularly the case for phase 1 studies in medicine, are very often focused on novel medicines that will have potential knowledge generated for the class of participants, but not necessarily benefit for the individual. But the later studies should lead to benefit for the individuals. And we're talking about the phase 3 and 4 trials that we do in medicines. And I'm sorry, since my background is medicine, we usually frame it in that context, but that goes true for social science interventions, for education interventions that you may be doing as researchers. You need to eventually make sure that it leads to knowledge that we can generalizable and eventually benefit that particular group of participants. Now, we know when we start planning that we are very often uncertain. We do not know what the outcome is going to be. This is actually why we're doing the research, and we need to acknowledge that we are uncertain that it will in the end have social value, but that should be our aim at all times. And it is especially problematic if your infrastructure is underdeveloped for the kind of research you want to undertake. So in that, we often say, rather choose another society or another community to do your research, because the infrastructure of this particular context is not applicable as it's underdeveloped. So those are also aspects that you need to think of. And in social value, there are a couple of questions you have to answer yourself, namely, who will benefit eventually? Will there definitely be potential value for the beneficiaries? What mechanisms can I as researcher undertake to ensure that I enhance the social value? And the important thing, which we'll come to again later, is collaborative participation. And how am I going to make sure that once I've seen positive results, how I'm going to disseminate it back to this particular society and particular community? And then at the same time, we should not undermine any existing services. Now, whether we're doing healthcare research or whether we're doing education research or other social science research, it should not be detrimental to the existing services that are there for the community members, because it should rather enhance and improve than undermine that. The very important next part then to reflect on is who's going to be my study population, how I'm going to select them, and will I be able to use them to reach scientific validity. And I'm going to give examples that I've seen through my career as an ethics review member. You will get a study that's saying, oh, we're going to study medicine A, it is for peptic ulcer, but we're only going to include participants who can read and write. Now, who is actually going to benefit from it? And when you ask the researcher, it says, yeah, but the informed consent is very complex. And, you know, if you can't read and write, you're not going to be able to understand it. So I want persons who can understand it. Now, that we'll say that is an unfair selection of study population, because the illiterate person has already been disadvantaged, especially in our South African history of education, by not being able to attend a school and to be able to read and write. And so that will lead to unfair selection of the study population. And just from my pediatric oncology, I'll remember I had two mothers on the same day for a phase 1 clinical trial in childhood cancer. So one was illiterate, the other one had a BA degree. The BA degree struggled to understand and did not want to participate and wanted the family to first discuss with her, while the illiterate mom said, I understand exactly, and she could verbally give feedback to me exactly what she understood, and she did understand it, and she could consent. So clearly we need to think how we make sure that we have a fair selection of study population. In this process, we should make sure that we minimize any potential risks. So we need to think about the benefit, but we also need to think about the risks that may be posed to this particular community or this particular participant, and make sure that I am able as a researcher to minimize that so potential benefit outweighs the risks. Again, we come back to the collaborative partnership to make sure that there's social value, so the community must be involved in and realize whether they want this intervention or not. And then in this process, we need to remember, and it's been said by the previous speaker, that there's always a power relationship. We are from the university, we are the researchers or the ethics review community members. We are the educated persons. We are often in a power relationship towards our participants. So the first thing we need to make sure is that we don't coerce our participants into participating because of this power relationship. But there's also other coercion that can exist, because you can have it in a familial context where a parent wants the child to participate, but the adolescent is refusing, can understand and is refusing. So we must make sure that there's no coercion of any participant. We also need to make sure that we do not marginalize our participants. And it was interesting during the HIV/AIDS era of major research, how we had to go about making sure that we limit the knowledge that this person is participating in an HIV/AIDS study, because that could lead to social marginalization. And I remember I was the ethicist on a large study where they were going to look at how orphans are doing and are they well looked after. It was a social science study, and what they wanted to do is go to a school and recruit them and say, oh, hi, all the orphans, please stay behind. We want to discuss with you your status. Now that was, of course, unfair way of dealing with the study population, because that would have led to social marginalization, because everybody would have done, those are the orphans. So you need to think of those kind of things. We need to think that very often our communities are powerless, they don't have political power, and we need to be sensitive to these potential power relationships. And then very clearly, those that are living in low middle income countries often have economic deprivation, and they shouldn't be exploited to be used in research unless it's really going to benefit them. So we must make sure that when we are doing something for them, that eventually that particular research will lead back to their communities to actually improve their lives and their qualities, and make sure that it benefits them all. So then we come to the very crucial issue, which is probably the most important part, where there's often major debates about the risk-benefit ratios. There's quite a number of ways of dealing with assessing risk-benefit ratio, and I was considering putting that in, but I think that is potentially for a further discussion, how to really think in terms of risk-benefit ratio. But the crucial benchmark is that it should be favorable. So whenever you are participating in research, you need to make sure that there's a favorable risk-benefit ratio. And this is a crucial task for anybody involved in research involving humans, whether it is now the researcher, the administrative staff, the research ethics review committee. We all need to make sure that we minimize risks and increase benefit. And so the risks can only be justified by the benefits that the potential benefits that the participants may gain from the research interventions, and they should outweigh the risks, except in certain circumstances where the social value of the research may justify the risks. And a good example probably is in medicine, and as I'm a cancer doctor, where you have phase 1 studies for cancer medicines. We know this cancer cannot be cured. You have a new medicine, you think, and you've tested it in the laboratory, you've tested it in animal models, and you think it has potential treatment for cancer, and then you start using it in patients who otherwise would have no treatment options because their cancer is progressive or refractory to treatment. Now there you can say there's social value because you've proven in animal models and in cellular models that there's potential benefits. And with my other hat, I'm a reviewer of new medicines at SAPRA. This is what you look at. And this is the kind of studies where you have social value that justify the risks. So Risk-benefit ratio should always be favorable in the context that the participants live in, and that comes back again. So you're not going to do this wonderful research in a war zone where people don't even have food, and you're going to have to let them walk to you while they can actually be shot at. So then you cannot do it. And the risk-benefit ratio should also be favorable to the particular community where the research is done. So again, it comes back to looking at your infrastructure, looking at the environment, and make sure that you minimize it. And again, by going back to the HIV/AIDS, we had to really take good care that nobody knew it was an HIV/AIDS trial, because at the time when we started, and even to this day, there's stigmatization and excommunication from communities of such members. And so one has to protect their confidentiality and their privacy. So that's very important in risk-benefit ratio. I've already referred to this quite often, and this is the collaborative partnership. When we are dealing with research, there's many stakeholders in a research process. It involves the researchers, it involves the sponsors of the research, it involves the communities where you are doing it, and then it's the actual members or participants that you have recruited. And so the collaborative partnership is probably one of the most crucial parts of research, in a sense, because we need to ensure that there's always a trust relationship between all of us. If we start losing the trust of the community, then they're not going to participate in the research, and then we're also not going to come to potential benefits of research that the interventions or the medicines can do. So it's very important that we have a very good relationship of trust between the communities and the researchers and the Ethics Review Committee, and for that reason, collaborative partnership in research is crucial. And it requires that there's representation of all, that there's active collaboration, that there's mutual respect for the participants and the communities and the researchers and the Ethics Review Committee members, that we minimize disparities for the communities with fair benefits to the community and fair distribution of rewards. Now, often it's easier when you are doing these big community-based research studies, as some social scientists are doing, and even large groups within the Faculty of Medicine where they're doing TB research and etc. But it may not seem so necessary in all environments, but there is always a group of people involved in that research process, and you need to define for yourself who are your stakeholders and how do I include them and how do I make sure that they are all represented and can collaborate and coming back to the mutual respect to ensure a good, trustworthy relationship between all. Informed consent is a topic on its own. One can talk about it a very long time, but that was probably the first part of the Nuremberg trials when they did it, and they realized all the abuses in the research process during the Second World War. And the crucial element was that the informed consent, the respectful persons were not there, and those persons on whom the research were done were never asked. They were not allowed to participate and say yay or nay. And so this comes back to the respectful persons. And this is a very old philosophical tradition that you need to respect a person for him or herself. And Immanuel Kant already states that a person is never a means to an end, but always an end in itself. So we need to respect persons for their autonomy. And in the context of doing research with adults, usually it's very easy and straightforward because you've got first-person consent, and this particular person has autonomy, can decide for self, has an own cultural framework and moral values with which they decide how they want to participate or not. And so it's a very straightforward relationship, but it again is built on trust. And so both parties, the participant and researchers, should trust each other, and it should respect each other. Then we come to third-party consent, and that is a whole new topic where we're dealing with vulnerable persons in the population. Easy one for me as a pediatrician is a child, where we need to ensure that whomever is going to give the third-person consent has an emotional tie between the third person and the participant. And I'll just use an example again. When we started HIV/AIDS research in the about 1995 to 1998, we had established an orphanage for children with HIV/AIDS. And so we were targeted by quite numerous companies to do research with these orphans for their new medicines. And it really made us reflect very carefully, can I really say yay on behalf of this particular participant if I'm only the director of the orphanage and do not necessarily have an emotional tie. So to me, it is crucial that the person going to give third-party consent for a vulnerable person needs to have an emotional tie and really the best interest of that particular participant at hand. Then when we're coming to informed consent, it's very important to document in your research process how you're going to recruit your participants. And so the recruitment strategy is very important to document because you need to make sure that you respect the traditions and culture of the community, that you do it in a sensitive manner so that you don't upset them. And so it's really important to document what your recruitment strategy is, taking all these facts into consideration. Part of that is compensation, and we all know that in South Africa, we say that research participants should be compensated for their time in some way or another, and there's quite a number of numerous guidelines, but it's an interesting thing across a global context that in some local cultures it's quite acceptable and expected, while other cultures may actually find it offensive. So you really have to think in terms of the context where you're working in, ensure that you are doing it in a manner that is according to the values and the cultural ways of doing things in that particular community. Crucial part of the informed consent process, because this is a process, this is not a once-off, it's not just a piece of paper, but it's really to make sure that you disclose all the information that you discuss, especially the risks and the benefits to the particular person, and what time it will take them, and how comprehensive they will be. And it should be involve them all, but again, sensitivity for culture of that particular community is crucial. It is also important that you have an independent observer, and in the South African context, GCP guidelines always expect at least 2 witnesses that are not part of the research team who then document and sign off to say that there is voluntariness of consent, which is really crucial because we need to establish that the particular person is not coerced into participating and that there's true understanding of the research process and that it's truly voluntary. And then in this informed consent document, it should be stated to the participant that they can refuse at any particular time with no detrimental impact on their health or life, or they may withdraw at a later stage when they think they do not want to participate any longer. So the last, coming close to the end, there should be independent review, and it's very important that we have ethics review by an ethics review committee that, again, should also have the public trust and should be accountable to the public to say that we are doing a good job. We should be transparent in our decision making to both the researchers and the community. It should be independent, and it's really important to note that even though we've got ethics review committees on main campus and in the Faculty of Medicine Sciences, it's important to realize that there cannot be interference from the authorities, namely senior management of Stellenbosch University at all. They are completely independent because they should not be coerced into doing research that is not really in the benefit of participants. Then we come to the members of this particular committees, and they should be competent with the knowledge of research ethics and science. So therefore, usually we do aim to target researchers that are having a good research career, but thereafter they should be trained in ethics review processes to make sure that they can benefit from it and that they understand the ethics as well of it. There are different models for ethics review. Usually the one used in Stellenbosch University is where we as members review the protocol, debate the protocol, the pros and the cons, the ethics of it, and then come to discuss our disagreements, discuss and come to a consensus. So it's usually by consensus. This process should be documented and should be open to inspection. We are often audited by the National Health Research Ethics Committee, as already mentioned, but also as there's lots of sponsors from overseas, the NIH can come and audit us, the FDA can come and audit us, SAPRA can come and audit us. So it is really important that it's well documented and everybody can see how this review was done. So then the last one is respect for communities. We should respect our participants and their communities. We have the obligation as researchers. We should make in this process privacy and confidentiality is crucial. We should make sure that that is maintained at all times. And then the important thing, which we don't always think about as researchers, is when we get the new information generated, and this is very often quite a while down the line, we should start sharing this new information specifically with the participants and the community, so they also benefit from that new knowledge. And this is especially if there's a change in risk-benefit ratio. And it's interesting, this is becoming the topic of the current European Union, where they want to say, how do the researchers ensure that this new information is shared to the communities where this research has been done? So all adverse events should be monitored and addressed, and we should also share this information back to the community. And one of the crucial aspects, this is easy in psychology research and medicine to understand, but even in education, if you then pick up any other issues that are not part of your research process, but need intervention or need care, termed ancillary care, we should make sure that that is available. And it's easier to explain in medicine. If I'm now doing malaria research, but suddenly I have a participant who's got active TB, I've got to make sure as a researcher that there's a group that will look after the TB component that I've now diagnosed in the process. Although I'm focused on malaria, this person should get ancillary health care for the tuberculosis. So that is important to document as well in your protocol, what kind of ancillary care may be needed and what is arranged beforehand so that that is available to all. So then we come to objectives to this framework. Emmanuel himself says it is complex. It may sound that there's a lot of barriers against research. That is not really what it's meant to be, but it is actually to guide and to assist and to help researchers and ethics review members to think about what all these issues, because research per se is a very complex process, and we need to acknowledge that there may be disagreements, and because there's disagreements, we need to come and debate them and discuss them and come up with what is best for the particular community with this particular group of participants. Then finally, there's many types of ethics review processes, and I just want to say that my students and my colleagues in Africa often say, oh, all these guidelines are focused on high-income countries and westernized worldviews. And so we came up with a textbook that we wrote, Research Ethics in Africa, which is free available online. A resource for research ethics committees, but it can also be used by researchers. There's three types of reviews: the standard review, there's the expedited review, and that was complicated during COVID, so we started elaborating into urgent review. And then there's, of course, continuing review of high-risk studies, and this is quite a process. So just to summary, when we then review a protocol, and this I'm really focusing on how we look at a protocol coming from a researcher, is you will look, is there a good written literature review, summarizing the previous related research and really documented then the person who's doing the protocol should also say what they think will be novel in their research, why it should be done again. There should be a very good research question that leads to a good aim and a hypothesis with appropriate objectives. In the methodology, one will make sure there's a scientifically valid design, look at sample size, who are the study population, is it equitable selection, what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria, how will the data be collected, what will be the statistical analysis, what's the duration of the study, what's the recruitment strategy the researchers are going to do, how's the informed consent process going to take place, will confidentiality and privacy be ensured for the participants, and will they be respected in that? Do the researchers have the necessary qualification and proven expertise in the proposed field of research? And this is really very important, because very often this is where we find problems, that researchers are branching more and more into transdisciplinary research and sometimes do not have the qualifications for that particular field of research. And then the crucial part, the careful risk-benefit assessment, to make sure that there's not more risks than benefits in this potential study. That's not acceptable. And with that, I want to say thank you very much. The main aim of research ethics is the safety and respect of persons, and I think we all want to be respected for ourselves as persons. So if we just think about it, that's where it comes from. And then if we want to practice good science, whether it's social science or human science, make sure that we have good facts and that leads to good ethics. So good science goes to good facts, goes to good ethics. Thank you very much. And this is now open for discussion.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Kruger. Thank you, Professor van Wyk. We have quite a bit of questions for you all, and there you probably saw there was very much activity in the chat line. I think I'm going to go through the questions one by one, and just ask it one by one, seeing that we have enough time. And colleagues, if there are additional questions, please feel free to either post in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function and we will get to your question momentarily. So the first question is actually by Mr. Ndlebe, who asks, in reality, we do know that most research is done in poor countries with little to no benefit to local communities or people. How do we hold these researchers accountable?
I would disagree with that statement. I think it's a very broad statement. Having spent 20 years now training ethics review committee members for Africa, this is exactly why that training program was started, and they now are the trainers in their countries to train their ethics review committee new members. And the crucial part is to make sure that the research that you are doing is really going to benefit the participants. In the early 90s, it was true. This is what led to this particular document. For instance, everybody was doing HIV/AIDS research, but trypanosomiasis was a quite big problem in Central Africa, and nobody was doing any research on it. So nowadays, these members will say, no, but this is not going to benefit our society. This is not going to benefit my community. No, we're not going to allow this. And I want to take a word from Elizabeth Bukuzi, who's one of the co-authors in that particular book that I referred to. And she's from Kenya. She's a leading, she used to be a leading researcher. She's now a leading research ethicist, working both in Kenya and in the US. And she started the whole thing about tissue transfer, saying that at the time exported so many Kenyan blood samples and tissue samples that could actually create a whole population of Kenyans outside of the country. So she's very active on it. So I think that's a bit of a broad statement. I think it can still happen, but this is why it's very crucial that we carefully, both researchers and ethics review committee members, evaluate, is this truly beneficial for the community? Will it lead to benefit in future? And only allow it if it's within that context valuable to them. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Our university and universities, or many of the other universities in Southern Africa, have subscribed to, Clarissa, you have to correct me, but a universal agreement about working in resource poor communities. And that agreement ties all of our research to researchers to a commitment to do, as Professor Kruger said, research that benefits communities. So you're already bound by being at Stellenbosch to do, if you work in a resource poor community, to do responsible research and research that will benefit that community. So you can't really get around it anymore if you work in the South, and many universities in the North also now subscribe to those guidelines. So that audit culture is coming for you. You know, it's just expanding across the world, but it also does good. As I said in this case, forcing us to be responsive to the place where we do research.
Yeah.
Clarissa, would you like to lob the next one?
I would. I'll post in the chat just to let everyone know. I'll post in the chat later on the code that Prof van Wyk referred to. But the next one, there was quite a lot of activity in these questions. That is, sure. It's I think Prof Kruger, it was in response to when I think you were sharing an experience in terms of recruiting literate versus recruiting illiterate participants. And the question was, what is a solution that you're willing to put forth in terms of illiteracy versus informed consent? And so that is the one layer of the question. And the follow-up question to that was, if you suggest a translator, who would be liable for the recruitment of such a person and the cost? And this researcher's concern is, especially it was Mr. Meyrink who said that if funding is limited, can you appreciate that the PI would be incentivized to possibly skew the population sample in order to circumvent costing issues that would, of course, inhibit the study from taking place at all. So a lot of these practical concerns that often affect the ethics of a study. If you could comment on that, please.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think it's an interesting question. It's one that I don't think I'm going to have the perfect answer to. And this is the problem with research ethics. You never have the perfect answer. But the thing is about, you need to really ask yourself, if I'm only going because of funding issues to recruit those that can read and write, then am I ethically justified to do this research? Because you see, the illiterate person already has been disadvantaged, and I think we can take our South African background, has already been disadvantaged by society by not having access to the necessary education and schooling to be able to read and write and understand for self. And is that truly acceptable then to say, well, I'm only going to do that? And I must say, I'm very adamant about the fact that we may not exclude on the basis of illiteracy. And so this means if I'm going to plan for research for that, then I have to find ways of dealing with that funding issue. Again, there's innovative ways that one can think about. I mean, you don't necessarily have to wait for a sponsor or your PI or your NRF grant or Brian Mayosi grant, but you can potentially go to church organizations and say, listen, are there volunteers to assist me? I need this. But I don't have the funding, and I don't want to exclude somebody that can potentially benefit from it. And this is a benefit that I think. I mean, this is just what I'm thinking at the top of my head. But I must say that I can say to you as an ethics review committee member, you're not going to get past me by saying I don't have funding for that. That will not fly, period. Sorry.
Mariana, yeah, we do in human sciences or social sciences, we accept verbal consent that you record. So as a way around the issue of, someone having to sign and being embarrassed, for instance, not being able to read. So if you go into a community, and this is what we advise our researchers, if you go into a community that you can always look at the statistics of a place. If you can see there's a large number of people who can't read, who are illiterate, you have to go in already prepared. So don't then shove papers in people's faces they have to sign, but have a verbal consent protocol in place. So you can record when people say, they agree. So you'll tell them what the research is about verbally, and they record, and you record their consent. So it's also to save someone from the embarrassment. So both things are ethical considerations. It's inclusion and not to embarrass people, not to, and as I said, very importantly, dignity. Is something that we focus on very centrally. And then in terms of funding, I answered a little bit in the chat. It's very problematic if you start skewing population sampling just because you don't have money, because that then affects validity. And that's an ethical question. Because if you waste time, i.e. if you waste people's time by running a study that isn't replicable, then actually that work is wasted, and that's unethical. So there's two ways in which that could be an unethical study. So rather plan a study that you can afford and that you can do, rather than trying to skew things, because then you're going down a very dark hole. Yeah.
Can I just come on that? I mean, illiteracy per se does not exclude a person. I mean, there's lots of guidelines for how to deal with it and get valid informed consent, even if the person cannot read and write. It just means that there's more witnesses involved in that. But I just want to share maybe a story that researchers that we had a major issue with as research ethicists about 10, 15 years ago, that if researchers went to China to do research, they found that the participants would be very reluctant to put their hand on paper, even though they could read and write, because they've been used to that politicians will come and they had to sign, and the next minute they would be without any property and so on. So they came up with innovative new ways of doing that and doing some print with good witnesses. So it's just more that your informed consent process is far more complex when you are dealing with an illiterate person, because you need to have members that, not research team members, but other voluntary members who will then document that this is voluntary consent. So that is not an issue. The other thing, coming to the translation, I do think as a university, we are a standard acknowledging 3 languages in this particular university. So I think within the framework of the university and in the framework of the subsidy that they are being generated by researchers, I think we should be adamant on having that support from our universities to translate at least in the 3 official languages that this particular university subscribe to. But illiteracy should not exclude anybody, and if it's going to lead to bias in your selection of participants, then it's poor science and then it cannot continue. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I think the question was also was Mr. Mayer, and the question was also about. I might have misunderstood you. I thought you meant translation in the field. So when you stand in front of someone you can't speak their language, in that case, I don't think university will cover your translation costs. But definitely, I agree with Mariana with you about university does actually has a translation service already in place. So please do make use of them. They are funded by Clarissa. I think DRD pays for some of it.
No, they don't.
Oh, not yet. It's not part of the budget yet. Okay, we're getting there.
It's not part of the budget yet, but yes, it is paid for. And I think Mr. Maydang, I made a comment there about some other innovative ways that researchers have opted for when they couldn't, where there were cost implications for formal translations being done by a translation company. Sometimes when researchers involve community members in their work and they do more participatory research, often these community members also sometimes assist with translation, and then it's a bit more accurate to the local context. But that was another option that I found from other researchers. I don't know if Ilana or Prof Kruger, you want to
No, I don't know. I see you've shared the article of Doug Wassenaar and Kathy Slack, How to Love Your Research Ethics Committee. Now, Doug is my co-director of SARETI, just by the way, and Kathy is very much involved in SARETI. So it's really worthwhile for any of you to read anything that either Doug Wassenaar, Kathy has especially worked on HIV/AIDS and the ethics around it and adolescents in research. So they're really good authors to read.
Yeah. I'm reading a question here by Ms. Ngwenya.
Yes,
asking about power differentials. Now, Ms. Ngwenya, depending on the kind of research, I mean, I'm a social scientist, so in our field, that's one of the first things you assess is, how you relate to others and how you stand, in relation to them in terms of gender, in terms of race, especially in places like South Africa, in terms of education, money, and all of those kind of things. So when you go to a place, you kind of map those things out beforehand, making sure that you know what the dynamics will be, and you, for instance, start with just how you get consent. That already signals to the person that you're not demanding that they participate. For instance, giving people the free choice to leave a research study. I mean, we've had some researchers apply, to give you one example, in which they're not sensitive to the hierarchies. In which they demanded that if people wanted to leave a study, they needed to write a letter and explain why. Now, that immediately tells the people that participate in your research that you are the boss. And they need to explain to you why they need to leave. And that is not sensitive to the context within which we operate, for instance, right? So right from the get-go, you need to be sensitive to those kind of issues of hierarchy, issues of power, and not start flaunting that, from the start. For instance, not demanding that people show up to a central location if you know that they don't have the money to get there, or if you can find out that they don't have the money to get there. Not behaving like a boss. These people are giving freely of their time and very often of their health to participate in our research. There needs to be a humbleness around research, and you can often see that in research design. The kind of, for instance, thanking people for research by giving them, let's say, a food parcel. There's a generosity there that marks a relationship very differently than if someone, for instance, as I said, demands that you write them letters and tell them why you're late or why you're not pitching up on time and so on and so forth. So it's something that is central to research design as well. Mariana, I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, I just think, I mean, it's one of the things that my field is slightly different. So I dealt mainly with children with cancer. And if I go to a family member and I say, well, I've got a new study and I've got a new medicine, I've realized that I've got to remove myself, because regardless of what my relationship is, they see me as a doctor with a know-all. And some communities, just because you are the doctor, will say yes to whatever you say. And for that reason, to me, the recruitment and the informed consent process should be well documented, where one can see that the researchers have attempted to minimize the power relationship, because we cannot get away from it that we as researchers are, or ethics review members are the educated of society. And now we're going to community and they will immediately think, you know better. And I mean, I've had parents that would say to me, well, what do you say? Don't you think my child should participate? You know, and you don't want that. You want them to really think and reflect and decide for themselves. And there's no easy way about it. And I think one also has to really take note. I want to pick up from you, Ilana, is that about your own personality. Now, I'm quite a forceful character, so I'm definitely not going to be the one doing the recruitment. I'm going to get a team member, because I know everybody will say, oh, yeah, but she's a doctor, she knows. And they may be influenced by it. So I have to somebody else explain, especially I used to work a long time, 25 years in an African hospital up north. And so there, with dealing with all 11 languages, and I've had trusted members of society who actually did the translation for me and did the recruitment part, so that it wasn't me, the doctor, coming in say, this is a new medicine, try this. So one has to think about these kind of things. Am I going to, if I do it myself, will there be a power relationship? May I unduly influence persons to actually participate because I think this is the status of this particular person, and so on. So it comes back, and I think this is what research ethics is, which is a branch of bioethics, which is a branch of ethics, which is a branch of philosophy, is you have to think, you have to reflect, you have to think in all these contexts and various ways, and make sure that you think as broadly as possible about the potential issues that can be and how do I minimize it. I hope that's a little bit helpful.
Thank you, Prof Kruger. Thank you, Ilana. There's 2 more questions. We have 4 minutes left now. I'll start with the one. The one by Tumi-san was, what other considerations does one have to make for research assistants other than an NDA and compensation? Do you have any tips in your experience on appointing research assistants, and what are some of the things you consider there?
Well, well, it depends on the field. I think Mariana's research assistants would be people who know something about medicine, and mine are people who know something about the group where I work. So if I do recruit people in the area where I do research, it needs to be someone who wouldn't, for instance, cause ructions in the community. You know, someone who wouldn't start, I don't know, forcing people behind my back to do the work and so on and so forth. And for that, and this is, I think, what Mariana also suggested is before you enter a field, there is many ways in which you can do a bit of research on the dynamics of that field. What's going on, who speaks what language, who lives there. I mean, all of us have access to the kind of statistical data that has been gathered by, for instance, in South Africa, by the Stats SA. So you can kind of sort of figure out what goes on in a place. You can, for instance, look at local newspapers. Is there a someone who always causes trouble? Maybe that's not someone you want to include as a research assistant. So the responsibility as a researcher is on you to do that pre-research that will actually make your research easier. So this research ethics is a lot about preparation and responsibility and forethought and planning. Rather than just, here's the 5 guides and the 10, the 5 pluses and the 5 minuses. It is about planning and forethought. Mariana, you have something.
Yeah, I'm not really. I'm going to just again perhaps use examples. Having been for the last nearly 14 years, the executive head of pediatrics and child health till December. Now you'll know there's 2 major research centers within that department, namely Desmond Tutu Tuberculosis Center and FAMCRU, which used to be KIDCRU and focusing on HIV/AIDS research. And if I say to you, because I mean, when you're a head of department, when they get the Nobel Prize, it's them that creates it. But if there's a problem in the unit, it's the head of department's got to sort it out. So this is why I know about it. And it was usually where the wrong person was appointed as a research assistant, who either falsified information generated or who did not go out and get the informed consent and just got it signed without being the actual participant signing it, and things like this. So it's really probably, and there was recently a question, should they be part of the research team or not, or should they be documented as administrative support team? So there's quite a lot of issues to think about, and I don't have a straightforward answer, but it's really very important to look at whom you select as a research assistant, make sure that that person will be acceptable to the community where you are recruiting your participants from, and that the person will be trustworthy, will be diligent, will be honest. We cannot get away from those values that are crucial. That's crucial in general life, it's crucial in research, and especially where we can lead to exploitation of participants if done wrongly or lose the trust. And we must realize we can do successful research if we have the trust of the community. If we lose the trust, then that is lost. So that's just some of the examples that I would think of.
Yeah. Larissa, you had one more question.
Yes, there's two now actually. I've just asked Ismarie, I hope that it's okay. Ismarie, there was a question about, are there any guidelines on how the researchers share the information with participants? And related to sharing information is also, I see here that Dr. Malindi has also added a question to the chat in terms of with regards to informed consent. How does one balance the need to provide all the information so as to ensure that consent is informed, and on the other hand, revealing too much information about the nature and purpose of the study that leads to participants changing their behavior? I think, Ilana, we get that question quite often about the risk of priming researchers into, or participants rather. I wonder if we can handle both questions. Oh, Ismarie said that she can, that I can check back with both of you later for her question, if that's okay.
Perfect. On the informed consent, yeah, you're right. We do get it often, especially in social sciences. You want to test some hypothesis, but you don't want to prime people and then they change their behavior. And the thing that you wanted to test is no longer, the thing that you're testing. We always say, and I think this is an ethical issue that comes up over and over again, you have to tread that fine line between covert research and actually, doing the work that you plan. So make sure that what you want to test is not something that you can also do spying. And to make it very clear that you are not actually trying to spy on people. And to be quite frank, very few of our informants, participants, are actually primed by the informed consent form. People will not read it and immediately change their behavior. I think we put too much emphasis on exactly how much power we have in that moment. I don't know, Mariana, in medicine it looks a little bit different, but definitely in social sciences, if you tell someone I'm doing research on, let's say, drinking behavior, and you then ask them questions, I don't think they will immediately, very seldom immediately respond by, kind of lying to you about their drinking habits. People are, you'll find very generous actually when they do participate in social research. There's a generosity that we also have to acknowledge and not just be suspicious that people will lie to us or not do what we want them to do. I think it's also an attitude to have towards our participants that I sometimes teach my students is also an ethical responsibility. Mariana.
Yeah, I think it's really depending on the kind of research you're doing, because very often in social science you want to do covert research, but on the other hand, if you do it in health sciences, you're actually doing it because you think there's benefit, and then you have to mention all the risks. And this is where we sometimes find a problem, is that the researchers want to actually drive the process so much of doing the research that they sort of undermine the reality of what risks there may be. So in that context, you have to make sure that you say exactly, this medicine will make you nauseous, this medicine will make your hair fall out. I mean, I'm using again my background as a cancer doctor, this medicine will lead you to get more infections. I cannot minimize that because it's going to happen, and I can't sort of obfuscate the truth. So I've got to give the truth. The important thing, however, is we also need to realize that informed consents nowadays are very complex documents and long pages. And there's if you look at the Nuffield, and I think one should take note of what Nuffield Bioethics Group are doing, they really come up regularly with new reports of how to, or new guidance documents. And you should have a summary of a one-pager, at least for the participant, of a 20-page document, documenting all the risks and benefits. But in the context of healthcare, usually you have to give them all the facts and they have to understand it. But what we find interesting, and I've had a master's student from Soweto doing it, and we want to publish it soon, on the readability and the comprehension of these informed consent documents. Now, the guidance document from the NIH will say to you that a 14-year-old or a grade 9 should be able to read it and easily understand it. And that's the kind of language you should use. And if you go into it, it's very often very complex that even I, as a PhD person, struggle to read and understand. So informed consent process, as I said earlier, is something that one can talk a lot about, and it really also depends on the context that you are dealing with. And but I think we cannot obfuscate the truth in any way when it's not going to be detrimental to the research question. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
Clarissa?
Prof Kruger. Thank you, Ilana. I think we've covered all the questions except for Esmery's one, which we will get back to her on that. Thank you. All round comments in the chat about it being a very informative and insightful session. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing your experiences, very helpful experiences as far as I can read from the chat, and you've answered many of the questions that were raised. So any last few points before we finalize the session?
Well, I just want to say that it's my first participation in the session. I think it's an excellent session, and I must really say to the participants who attended, thank you for your very comprehensive queries and questions, because it actually makes me think more, and I'm not quite sure that we've answered it really well, because you've brought up some of the complexities that I haven't thought about. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to add my thanks to all of you for attending and asking interesting and important questions, and being just being here means that you're already interested in ethical engagement with your participants, which is a heartening thing to see, and in such great numbers. People always say people hate the ethics committee, but the numbers say something else. Thank you all, and looking forward to more conversations from you.